and if the effective charge depended upon relative motion, the charge that you measure depends on relative motion, then the electronic charge in that material would change. But the ions don't move very quickly, so that wouldn't change. So you get an imbalance. You heat a material up, and suddenly it would become charged. It would be uncharged at one temperature, you heat it up, you get a field. That is not observed. That's not observed to something like 1 part in 10 to the 10th, or something like that. It's really easy to measure the presence of charge. They don't. They actually did the experiments, and the experiments continue. And so charge is invariant, and Elon.
As much as I hate the argument, is it possible that it's one of those things where they're just not heating the charge up enough?
I'm just going to say no. Right. I would suppose that there's always some crazy person's way of putting all the logic together that could make a self-consistent argument in which you would say special relativity is not even a good approximation, and what you should actually be using is this other approach, and that in fact the electrons are not speeding up despite the fact that we measure, when we do can pop them off, we measure different velocities, and we can scatter off them and measure their velocity. There's lots of stuff that we can do, but all of that's probably dependent upon special relativity for interpretation. So there might be a way through this, but I know this way through fits together consistently until finally we get to expansion of the universe, which poses a problem. Early inflation, which poses a problem. So we've basically built our theoretical framework out to a certain point that explains all of this. And then there's some other stuff out there that is, it's not like we're not looking at it, but we can't actually explain it properly. And right now we've said we will be able to explain it properly. But I personally don't think that we have. Okay. So that may mean that just like in 1900, the whole edifice, not the whole thing, but pieces of the edifice fall down once we finally accept certain aspects of actual measurement. But for now, I'm going to be optimistic, and I'm probably safe in my optimism because I'm 60 years old. And I don't think that the edifice is going to come down in the next 15 to 20 years. So it's your problem. I love it.
And
What?
and the small amount of charge differences, would it be safe to say that that could quite possibly be due to one electron gets heated up enough so that it actually pops off completely, and that's just a small change in charge?
It would go the other way,
Oh,
for one thing, if it were to be the case that would apply here, right? And we can talk about the difference in charge that's measured between 0 Kelvin and room temperature. And the rate at which we would boil electrons off is so low that I would say the actual measurement is not effective.
yeah, because you said there was a like 1 in 10 million or whatever.
Actually, I don't know. Let's just say that Ohanian assures me that the measurements are excellent, and I trust him.
Yeah.
Because he's actually, if you know him, he's a person who really questions everything at the deepest level. So he doesn't just accept these things. The reason that he put the description of the experiments in his textbook is because he wants to clearly say, we know this well. And so I'm going to continue with my theory because we know this well. That doesn't mean that we know it perfectly. But I think that the measurements that are made are corrected for thermionic emission possibility. Okay, so charge doesn't change. So now let's look at what happens here. If I'm moving this capacitor along, what's going to happen is in the direction of motion, I'm going to get lane contraction. And so the new charge density is going to be equal to Q, let's call it L0x, L0y. That is in the rest frame of the capacitor. And that's going to contract, so I'm going to get a gamma up top. Yes?
If it were moving in both x and y directions at the same velocity, would you have a gamma squared there, or would you have a different velocity?
Yeah, you'd have gamma x, gamma y.
Okay. Could you instead redefine your axes?
That's what I would do. Yeah.
Here earlier when we wrote down is gamma next to x, unless it's a dx.
Okay.
You wrote x prime
Yeah.
equals gamma.
So I'm going to write it this way. The length, which is the difference between this position and that position, measured in some frame, okay, is, so the length that's measured for the primed frame, that is, you're watching it go by, and you're observing that occurring in that frame, is equal to the, yes, the length in the proper frame of whatever is being measured. So I've got a yardstick, a meter stick that's moving along in space. In its own proper frame, if you're with the meter stick, you measure 1 meter. And if the meter stick's moving with respect to you, then you measure something shorter than 1 meter. Right? So that's the relationship that we want to use. Okay, and similarly, all right, delta t prime, the time between two events, is equal to t times gamma, delta t times gamma. So that's like a delta, that is a delta x, delta x prime, delta x. Okay? But this means that the electric field has changed. Right? So the electric field, by this argument, does transform. Okay? And we can say that the electric field, now this is a plausibility argument, right? We're going to come back and we're going to do everything more properly in space-time coordinates and intervals, all of that. We're not going to derive it, but we're going to go through and show what the conversions for the electric field and the magnetic field are by the time we're done. But for now, I'm just giving you a conceptual plausibility argument for why things might change. And that is, I don't even have to know that that charge is out there. All I have to know is that there's an electric field in this region, and if I conceptualize that field came from charge that's sitting out there, then when I move with respect to that charge, the electric field is going to change. Okay? The electric field parallel to the motion proper, is gamma times the electric field in the proper frame of the charge. Right? The electric field perpendicular to motion, from what we can tell here, is just the electric field, the proper electric field, perpendicular to the motion. Yes? That's what you would ask. Good. Yeah. Okay. I do want to note here for those of you who read outside of the text, Ohanian doesn't actually make this argument. I think it's I like it. Right? And I picked this argument up initially actually teaching honors physics 2 out of the textbook by Purcell. I think it's called Electricity and Magnetism. And then those of you who want to read a really nice text at a lower level than this course, a lower mathematical level than this course, but at a lovely conceptual level, Purcell's a really good book. And I understand, actually, it has been out of print for a long time. we actually got the publisher, McGraw-Hill, to reproduce it for us when Napolitano and I taught honors physics to the start. We used it, but then after that, we found that you guys were having problems with Purcell, so we went back to Halliday Resnick Crane. But at that time, we had to get a special printing. It was very expensive. And now it looks as though it's being produced both, again, in an international version, and there's going to be a U.S. version as well. The U.S. version is only going home. It's going to be like $80. So it's not a super expensive textbook. It's a nice
What's the
book.
difference between international and US?
International is not actually legal to be sold in the United States. It's usually sold like the international version of Bohemian. There isn't one. Well, let's say Griffiths. The international version is probably $8 in India, and it's possible to purchase on the printed webs, but I don't know how to do that.
Of course not.
So Purcell is a really good source for this argument. And the other place where I actually got it was Griffiths. And then after that, I discovered that it was in the book by Feynman.
Of course. It's fine.
Feynman doesn't have simple arguments. Okay. Actually, he has elegant arguments. And you might think elegant arguments are simple. But his arguments are subtle. You've got to be very careful when you read Feynman. Yeah.
Just a quick question. When you say the electric field, it only gets.
Yeah, so I could think of, right, this an electric field in some region of space as being, so let's forget about the capacitor plates. And in some region of space, I've got an electric field, E, let's call it E parallel, E parallel, and E curve. Well, hold on a minute. Let me think about this a minute.
Because what you were saying with the
No,
capacitor plate.
the other one is, yeah, I have to switch this. The field along the direction of motion doesn't change. The field perpendicular to the direction of motion does. That's really important, otherwise I don't get magnetic fields. Thank you for asking that. Is that what you were going to ask?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right, so now I've got that conversion. Let me see whether I want to do this one or not. Yeah, I'll do this one. There was an eraser. There it is. Okay. So I've got those conversions for the electric field. But actually, let me make a similar argument, starting from scratch, not worrying about the conversion that I just got for the electric field. Let me talk about what you might observe if you have current flowing in a conductor. And this argument, by the way, I should say that Feynman makes very nicely. So, current flowing in, current flowing out, and I'm gonna have two reference frames. The reference frame of the wire. So actually, let's say it's a reference frame of the average nucleus in the wire, right? And then I will have an external charge, which might be moving, but we're not gonna look at that quite yet. All right? Let's actually look at the charge density in this thing. So for an external observer, that's an eye. For an external observer who's in the frame of the wire and just observing this, we've turned our voltage source on. There's a difference in potential between the two ends of this wire of 10 to the minus 6 volts. Make it a very conductive wire. A really small difference in potential between the two sides. This observer looks at this and sees no net charge. This is a neutral wire, right? But what I've got in here are I'm going to simplify my argument for myself, right? And I'm going to say that I've got positive charges moving along. So assume that I'm measuring the frame. And they're moving along at some average velocity that I'll call the drift velocity. Despite the fact that they're moving, all right, so in this frame, the frame of the wire, every single one of those moving charges has got a compensating opposite charge that just sits in the background. So I've got 10 to the 28th of those per centimeter, per meter cubed, moving along at some low drift velocity. They don't move very quickly. It's 10 to the minus 4 meters per second, 10 to the minus 3 meters per second. They move slowly, but they're moving. Okay? And I look at this, and this is neutral. So in the frame of the wire, sigma electron is equal to sigma, well actually let's put sigma minus, no, lambda minus is equal to lambda plus the frame of the wire. Okay. Actually, let's perhaps ask now what happens if I move with respect to that wire. Okay. So I've got a drift velocity in there, and now I'm going to put a charge out here that's going to move at some other velocity. Let me call this one just B. B prime. Discuss. With respect to the wire, right? The two charge densities were equal before I started moving, right? But now, if I'm moving with the charge that's moving, I'm going to observe a charge density at some level, right? Which is going to transform as the sum of those two velocities because I'm moving with it, right? And I'm going to have a particular charge density that I'm going to measure. It's going to depend upon the relative velocities of the observer and the charge. It's not moving with the background charge. Background charge is still staying where it is. So I'm going to end up with a different density that I observe, a different transformation for the charge that remains behind. So the wire, in its original state, with the charge moving along, was neutral. You could say, hey, this is moving, so the density is different, but the fact is that for a stationary observer with a stationary wire, when you start driving current through the wire is, on average, neutral. So those two densities are the same for those two relative motions. Now we're going to observe from this frame, and what's going to happen is that the two densities are going to be different. Let me see if I got that. Okay. The direct current in the wire. The background is going to do this. So in this particular case, it's the negative background. lambda. So lambda, where did I put it down there? Minus lambda minus gamma. Okay, oh, let me be explicit about that gamma. It's lambda minus in the frame of the wire times 1 over the square root of 1 minus e prime over c squared. That's the relative velocity of the observer with respect to the wire. Okay. Yeah. That's the stationary background. Now I've got to worry about the charge that's moving along here, right? And I can do that transformation in two ways. One is taking the density in this frame as it is and adding the velocities. Or the other would be to ask, what's the charge density in the frame of these charges? You know, I'm actually just stating there are two ways to do it. One would be to work out in the frame of the wire, these two charge densities are equal. In the frame of the moving charge, the two charge densities are not equal to one another. Okay? So I'm just going to say that I took the relative addition of velocities approach here, and I end up with lambda prime plus observed, so that's observed by this moving frame, right, is lambda plus in the what was originally observed times 1 over the square root of 1 minus u over c squared, where u is got to be appropriately corrected as ux minus v prime over 1 minus v prime ux over c squared. Well, the relative velocity is going to be used there. So now I've got two charge densities that are unequal to one another. And so that means that if my observer here were a charge, it would be looking at that wire. As soon as it starts moving, those charge densities that were equal to one another become unequal. And when they become unequal, then there's electric field, which can be solved from Coulomb's law. So the relativistic transformations alone end up giving me a force, right? And that force is going to, in this particular case, the way that I just drew it, let me think about this. These become not as close as those. The force is going to pull in that direction. You see that I got that right. Now, I'm actually going to cheat and use Biot-Savart or Ampere's law to calculate it. Magnetic field goes that way. And QV